If you were a nerdy kid in the 90s, odds are you spent a lot of time watching this, the Sci-Fi Channel, the one station dedicated to science fiction, fantasy, and horror. You may think about it fondly as it might have been your introduction to classic science fiction, anime, kaiju, and horror. And when you think back, you inevitably end up at today. Its name is now spelled weird and you don't recognize any of the shows. And you think to yourself about how much better things used to be. Then a term pops into your head, Network Decay. How did sci-fi get from this to this? But to really understand how, we have to go back, way back, to before the Sci-Fi Channel even existed, to hear a story you've never heard before. This is the first part of my history of sci-fi. This is a story of the launch of the Sci-Fi Channel. During the 1980s, cable television had been expanding at an exponential rate. Fueled in part by the industry's deregulation in 1984, networks like HBO and MTV had quickly entered the American zeitgeist, and it seemed like every Tom, Dick, and Turner were starting cable networks. All you needed was state-of-the-art production facilities, access to a Telstar satellite, and then suddenly your little TV station was now a superstation. It's 1988, and husband and wife Mitchell Rubenstein and Lori Silvers are trying to think of an idea for their own cable channel. Mitch and Lori were attorneys/entrepreneurs. Am I supposed to say that slash bit out loud? Whatever. Many of their clients were in the cable industry, so they had a front row seat to its rapid growth, and they wanted in. They'd already tried their hand at running a cable carrier in Indiana, and were ready to make the big bucks, but they just needed the right idea.
With my partner, Mitchell Rubenstein, who's also my husband, but don't hold that against me, I decided that I wanted to create a cable network. It's a little task for an entrepreneur based in Boca Raton, Florida, with absolutely no relationship with any of the big boy players. Why not? Well, what's it going to be? We talked about the ideas, and I said, I've got it. It's going to be the hair and makeup channel, because all the women would love it. They all are concerned with their hair and makeup. It's going to be fantastic. Well, the first thing I had to do was convince my partner that this was a great idea. I couldn't do it. But he came up with something that I did think was interesting, the Sci-Fi Channel.
Lori was a little harder to convince. Not being into science fiction as much as I was, I took her to Blockbuster Video and showed her how many racks were devoted to science fiction. Then we looked at the top 10 grossing movies of all time, Star Wars, E.T., I think 7 or 8 were in the science fiction category.
But something interesting happened when I was at Blockbuster. I asked the manager, I said, so you got all these titles, but how successful are you? I mean, do people actually come in and rent them? And he said they rent them, and it's very interesting because it's a phenomenon we don't see in any other genre. They rent them, and in those days when you rented something from Blockbuster, you had to bring it back or pay a fine. So they would rent them timely, bring them back, and then rent them again. Doesn't happen in another genre, but science fiction fans are fanatic. And if they like something, they'll watch it over and over and over. And, you know, they're not shy about telling you that.
Now they had an idea, but they had to know there was an audience for a 24-hour science fiction network.
Now that I'm convinced, how do I take this and dress it up so that I can go out and talk to people about it? I had to conduct a national poll through the Gallup organization. They came back and they said, it's phenomenal. They said, not only is it phenomenal, but we polled people that are used to watching traditional cable TV. At the time, it was CNN for news, it was the Weather Channel, it was ESPN for sports, it was MTV for music. So all these classic networks, and they and the report basically said that everybody that's out there watching cable television will watch a Sci-Fi Channel. Some people like it for the old, and some people really want to watch the new science fiction, the more technology-based science fiction, but it's out there. The audience is huge.
It became more and more obvious that this was a huge missing niche, but once we became convinced, it was a matter of how do we launch the darn thing.
The Sci-Fi Network would be great. I think it should open up the eyes to the public.
We're waiting for the Sci-Fi Channel. We're dying for it.
Oh, I'm very much looking forward to Sci-Fi Channel because I love science fiction movies and television series and stuff like that.
You must make contact.
I wouldn't move from my chair.
Horror, science fiction, we're going to be watching 24 hours a day. It should have happened sooner.
Oh, this is great. I can't wait for it to come on.
I can't wait. When is it? I'll take off for work.
What's next? What's my next square? I had to get credibility.
Now this will be a recurring theme through the Sci-Fi Channel's history, credibility. Whether it be credibility with sci-fi fans during the birth of the network, credibility with mainstream audiences during the 2000s, or renewed credibility with diehard fans in 2014, Sci-Fi has always been a channel having to prove itself. Now, the way Mitch and Laurie decided to get credibility was by putting together a board of advisors. And they would need people that would give them credibility in the eyes of science fiction fans that would be the initial bedrock of the new network. And when you're talking about a network devoted to science fiction, you're dealing with a crowd that's pretty tough to please. And if you needed credibility, who had more credibility than Isaac Asimov?
Isaac Asimov, renowned scientist, teacher, and author, whose works of best-selling science fiction include The Foundation Trilogy and I, Robot.
We got to Isaac through one of his collaborators and met with him at a small Italian restaurant by his apartment in the Upper West Side of New York, and we hit it off. He said he didn't want to be compensated. He wanted to do it because it would be the best way to introduce science fiction to young people who don't read as much anymore. Now, this was great news, but Isaac didn't have much clout in the TV industry, and they need more than one person to make up a board of advisors. But Mr. Asimov was happy to help. Toward the end of dinner, he told us, "Look, a lot of people don't know who I am, but I have a very good friend in Hollywood who owes me a favor. I think he could add a lot of value to this, and let's give him a call and see if I can convince him to meet with you and perhaps join the board." And then he goes, "My friend is Gene Roddenberry." Now, in case you're wondering what kind of favor Gene Roddenberry owed Isaac Asimov, the story goes that over 20 years earlier, Gene, while working on the concept for the original Star Trek pilot, met Isaac after he spoke at a science fiction writers convention. He's working on a pilot for a TV show, and he was having trouble with the main character, the captain, interrelating to the second in command, Spock, in a relationship he thought was key to the whole thing. And right there in line at the end of the writers convention, Isaac said to him, "Make Spock half alien, half human." So it'd be an understatement to say Gene Roddenberry owed him one. Now cut to stock footage of LA and Hollywood as I explain how Gene Roddenberry gave Mitch and Laurie a tour of the Star Trek and the Next Generation sets before buying them lunch with his very own Star Trek credit card. Shit. I wasn't supposed to read those parts out loud. Screw it. Gene liked the idea of the network and was on board. Now so far, Mitch and Laurie had convinced two science fiction heavyweights to go along with a 24-hour science fiction network, but they still had a long way to go before they could convince everybody else. When you think about what problems someone may have launching a cable network, most of the problems you think will involve money and programs. But two of the Sci-Fi Channel's biggest problems was their name and space. Well, not like literal space. I'll explain that part in a minute. Nowadays, when people talk about sci-fi and talk about its network decay, they often cite wrestling and reality shows to show the network has strayed from its original premise. But understand that people have always been saying that about sci-fi, even before it launched. But back then they weren't criticizing it for its programming, they hated its name. It may seem hard to imagine now that anyone would have a problem with the term sci-fi. Author Hugo Gernsback is credited with helping popularize the name science fiction in the 1920s, and Forrest J. Ackerman coined the term sci-fi in the 1950s, and they quickly became points of contention. Many authors objected to them as catch-all terms that segregated the more serious works and lumped them in with anything that had a spaceship or an alien on the cover.
You really dislike the term science fiction, or is it fair to say hate?
I think I think loathe with an intensity and loathe the human race.
Right, you're not fond of it.
Why? Because I don't write science fiction. Isaac writes science fiction. Isaac can be justly called a science fiction writer. I write what Poe wrote, what Kafka wrote. I write a kind of surreal fantasy, but they can't put surreal fantasy on a paperback. The term science fiction is an utterly meaningless categorization that is used for the benefit of book dealers, so that they know to put all the books with women in grass ears being molested by green bug-eyed monsters over there, and all the ones with guys in Stetsons over there, and all the nurses looking at interns over there.
So you can imagine how people would think sci-fi was just a shitty contraction of a term they already didn't like. Also, check out how passive-aggressive Starlog got about the whole thing. In a Reddit AMA from 2014, Mitch recounts, "Before the Sci-Fi Channel launched, Isaac Asimov, Laurie, and I presented the concept to a packed room of SF writers at the Science Fiction Writers of America meeting. The writers were not happy, and that's an understatement. They said they wouldn't watch it. They would oppose it unless we called it the SF Channel, because calling it Sci-Fi Channel was a put down to the SF genre, and sci-fi is slang for SF and science fiction, and a huge mistake. And I said if we called it the SF Channel, people would think it was about the city of San Francisco. I was booed. Then Isaac started to speak and said the name had to be Sci-Fi Channel and not the SF Channel in order to draw a wide, diverse audience and be successful. The writers came around and agreed. Heck, it was Isaac Asimov saying Sci-Fi Channel was okay. And that was that. Now I need to explain that part about them needing space for the channel.
Most cable systems were channel locked, which meant that there were 64 networks that were being. Most cable systems were filled up. If they wanted to put us on, it meant that they had to kick somebody off.
By 1990, when Mitch and Laurie were initially crafting the network, cable television was essentially full. Clearances on cable providers were becoming harder to get. For example, Time Warner's Comedy Channel and the Viacom-owned rival Ha eventually had to merge in 1991, forming Comedy Central because cable providers literally didn't have room for 2 comedy networks. Similarly, the Turner-owned Cartoon Network's own launch was in limbo until coverage was guaranteed. Now, if you're going to have a cable channel, you're going to need some shows, and without the backing of a major corporation or network, it was slow goings for Mitch and Laurie. One of the most obvious shows, Star Trek, was unavailable, its syndication rights locked up for years to come, and Star Trek The Next Generation wouldn't be available for at least a decade. Meanwhile, other shows simply cost too much.
What do I do? Oh, I gotta get programming. How do you have a network with no programming? And we're talking about programming for a network that was going to be on the air from day one, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's a lot of programming. So I contacted the studios, and what I found was there was a lot of programming. Most of the programming, though, was not under science fiction. It was action adventure. So in the beginning, it didn't all become clear to me that there was enough programming to keep this going. But once I figured out that action adventure was just another way of labeling science fiction and charging more money, because you can get more money for action adventure than you can for science fiction.
But they were able to secure some notable shows, like the Tom Baker era Doctor Who and the 1940s Flash Gordon serials. But their biggest get may have been the gothic horror soap opera Dark Shadows, which had a devoted cult following and was even in the middle of a successful revival on NBC. But in addition to the licensed shows, they also plan to produce a slate of original programming for the Sci-Fi Channel as well, and they found a willing-ish partner in the Disney-MGM studios. Disney-MGM Studios opened in 1989 as a not-so-veiled attempt to steal the thunder from the still under-construction Universal Studios Florida. In a 2017 interview with Paley Matters, Mitchell recounts, "The idea we had that we thought would kind of make our lives a lot easier, that additional credibility," there's that word again, "beyond even Asimov and Roddenberry, was if we could get Disney to bring Sci-Fi Channel into Disney World." So in Disney-MGM Studios theme park, they had 3 big stages, and most of the time they did Disney stuff or pretend kind of productions. Let's pause and let me explain what he means by this. Disney-MGM Studios was and still is a working film and television studio, but in Disney's haste to open before Universal, they opened without lining up many clients for its studios. So one of the biggest companies in entertainment had brand new state-of-the-art production facilities that were basically empty. Not a bad place to headquarters your brand new cable network. But the Rubensteins didn't have any connections at Disney, so Mitchell had to get creative. I remembered the name of the bank from the ATM machines in Disney World the last time I was there, and by coincidence that was a large Florida bank and the one that we used. So I went to our local branch manager in Boca and asked him if we could get us a contact at Disney World. It took a little while, but he was able to arrange a meeting for us with the general manager at Disney World. They were impressed that Gene Roddenberry had joined and that we had a satellite transponder and stuff like that. So we had this great meeting, and they said, "There's absolutely no problem. This is a home run. Once you guys are closer to launching, get all your financing done, we'll make a good pitch to try and get it approved." But I said, "You don't understand. We need this as one of our pieces in order for the other things to happen." They said, "Then you're going to want to do a press release, and there's not any presence here." So I said, "Look, we're not taking no for an answer. Please get us a meeting with whoever runs the theme park operations for Disney in Burbank." They arranged the meeting in Burbank at Disney Studios in California and were ushered into the animation department. That's where the executives are. We go into this big office and Laurie and I sit down and he says, "Sorry you made the trip. I really like what you guys are doing. I'm sorry I totally breached on this. There's no way we're going to do this. Because you know we just don't do deals involving the theme park, the most valuable real estate in the world, unless you're ready to come in tomorrow. You really have a lot of other stuff to do and then you can come back and we'll talk about it." So that was really the end of the meeting. But then I said to him one last thought. "This is the Hail Mary," I said. "You know, Disney is the best brand in entertainment. The Sci-Fi Channel, everything we put together. If you slap that we're going to be at Disney-MGM Studios on it and we do that press release that you don't want to do, are you telling me that everything with Disney on it, that the Disney name is not powerful enough?" And he stood up, shook our hands for us to go, and we started to go, and then he said, "Wait a minute, I changed my mind. We're going to do it." Just like that. Yeah, chills went down my back. It was in the Wall Street Journal. We had cable operators calling us. They thought for sure that Disney was going to buy the Sci-Fi Channel. With the backing of Disney, it seemed like Mitch and Laurie finally had the wind at their backs and were gearing up for a 1991 network launch. And then the Gulf War happened and screwed it all up. With Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the build-up for Operation Desert Shield, and then Operation Desert Storm, cable was playing an even bigger part in American television viewing habits than ever before. Which would be great news if people were watching something other than CNN's round-the-clock coverage of the war. This was a terrible time to launch anything that wasn't a cruise missile, And in an odd bit of synchronicity, NBC's reboot of Dark Shadows was cancelled after a drop in ratings caused by the numerous preemptions for NBC News' coverage of the war, so the Sci-Fi Channel's debut was put on hold. By March of 1992, the Sci-Fi Channel was just months away from its debut, but you wouldn't know it judging from an interview Mitch Rubinstein gave to Starlog magazine. The network launch had been delayed so long that to some it seemed as if it may never actually happen. For all the work Mitch and Laurie had done to secure distribution, they were still only set to be carried by 3 of the top 10 cable providers in the United States. To help increase carriage with cable providers, Mitch made an unusual offer. Cable providers could broadcast the Sci-Fi Channel without a licensing fee for the first 2 years, meaning the only revenue the network would have would be from advertising. But Mitch remained optimistic. We have excellent projected demographics and we're running well ahead of our original projections of subscribers. We originally projected launching with 5 million subscribers, and we're 40% ahead of those numbers. It's fairly traditional in the cable industry that you have to reach about 20 million subscribers to break even. After that, it becomes profitable. In comparison, CNN and ESPN each had approximately 57 million subscribers. For all the hype surrounding the Disney-MGM deal, little had come from it outside a few press releases. No sets, no cast, no crew. In fact, of the 3 shows promised, NASA Watch and the very literally titled Comic Book Show and The Haunted House Game Show, they weren't sure when they would be made. 2 of the 3 will be on the air as of week 1. Since we're working on all 3 simultaneously, we haven't yet determined which shows will be delayed. And as far as series go, their biggest acquisitions were still Dark Shadows, Doctor Who, and Flash Gordon. Though they were able to obtain the rights to Space 1999, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, One Step Beyond, The Prisoner, and Star Trek. The animated series. That's still pretty cool. I mean, hey, they even used parts of the episode Yesteryear in the 2009 remake.
Your father brought Shane to Vulcan. He married a human.
He's a traitor, you know. Your father, for marrying her, that human whore.
So that's something. But they were still absent any heavy hitters, or one of a number of shows people usually associate with sci-fi. There was no Lost in Space, Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, Twilight Zone, or Outer Limits. In the interview, Mitch also tries to justify the channel's lack of more modern science fiction programming. Rather than state they simply don't have the money, he makes the case that many sci-fi fans prefer older films and shows. The public doesn't want the newer stuff. They want to see Conquest of Space, Robinson Crusoe on Mars, and things like that. If someone tunes in expecting to see E.T., Close Encounters, and Terminator, they're going to be very disappointed. Those films are just too new. They'd come a long way since that first visit to Blockbuster in 1988, but they still just couldn't compete. To do that, they would need more money.
And needed to raise about $100 million. And I had no idea how I was going to find it. Went the traditional route, went to Wall Street, see if I could raise it that way. And the one source that seemed like it would be the most viable for me was to go to strategics. Go to people that were in the business already, understood the business. You didn't need $100 million from day one. You just needed to have the money as part of your business plan so that you were able to pay for the satellite transponder, you were able to pay for the programming costs, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to the USA Network, which was owned at the time by the #1 rated cable network in the country, USA Network, owned at the time by Paramount and Universal. Major studios with huge libraries of science fiction programming. It was run by Kay Koplovitz, who was a real leader in the world of programming and cable television.
Now, I could probably do an hour-long video on Kay Koplovitz. Her achievements in cable television are nothing short of remarkable. I plan to dive more into her history in the next video, but for now, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Kay Koplovitz's career in cable began as the head of the Madison Square Garden Sports Network in the 1970s, and an early example of network decay, took a regional sports network and transformed it into the USA Network, which has since been the #1 rated cable network for, well, most years. At the time, Kay was president of USA Network, which is co-owned by Universal and MCA, who also owned Paramount Pictures. Laurie and Mitch couldn't find better partners than USA. They had money and the deep catalog of shows and films they would need to finally make the Sci-Fi Channel a reality. Insert Laurie quote about meeting with Kay. God damn it!
And a real fan of science fiction, loved and understood how important and how strong the audience for science fiction was and is. So after about 4 or 5 weeks of negotiating and discussing, she said, I love it. I definitely want to do this with you guys. I have my partners to go to. I'm going to sell it to them. So she went back to her partners, Universal and Paramount. And she came back and And she said, they love it, but they don't want any partners. They're going to do it themselves. So this is what's going to happen. We're going to buy it from you, or we're going to do it ourselves. You know, the world is a tough place. And though I could sell it to them, and with pride, because they operated a great cable network. These were 2 great studios. They had the bulk of the science fiction programming that we needed to buy to have for the channel. Or I could say, no, I've spent over 4 years of my life working on this. This is my baby. You do your thing, I'll do mine. Well, you know what happened. I made the right choice, because I don't think I could have gone up against them and done it successfully. Perhaps I could have today, because there's so many avenues of distribution. They didn't exist back then. So it was kind of their way or the highway.
Now this is where we run into a kind of, fork in the road as far as this story goes, because the way Lori explains how the sale of Sci-Fi to USA goes is a bit different than how Kay tells it.
Actually, Mitch Rubenstein had come around with his plans for Sci-Fi Channel. Mitch and Lori Rubenstein, and they had trademarked Sci-Fi Channel. They had bought some very old libraries. I would say my grandfather's sci-fi libraries, and they had started to negotiate some cable contracts, which were just dreadful. I loved it. I loved it because I knew the sci-fi fan was ardent, strong, and vocal. And I thought they'd be, great allies. And I knew it was a niche, but I thought it was a pretty big, broad niche. And when we did the research, we actually did go out and research libraries, and we came up with over 3,000 hours of programming in science fiction, science fantasy, and fantasy horror. And I thought those all fit under the umbrella. And I thought science fiction, I want to launch this. This is going to be a home run. And that I had to fight for. I had to really fight for that. And interestingly enough, Paramount, Stanley Jaffe was then running Paramount. He did not want to launch this network. When signing the contracts, I get a telephone call. I said, "Oh, Stanley, it's too late. We've just signed the contract. Oh, I'm so sorry. We can't change the clause now." I mean, it was just like, I couldn't believe it. I was like livid, but I was smarter by that time. So we did sign the contract and bought these nascent rights from the Rubensteins and launched Sci-Fi.
And what's your impression of the network today?
The Sci-Fi network? Oh, I think it's a glorious network. I think it's so much fun because I never felt it was limited. One of the reasons I wanted Sci-Fi is because I like the unknown. And I think science fiction, you have permission to do the unknown. You have permission to do unthinkable things, good and evil, I guess, but no one can say it can't happen that way because it's in the future.
Now they were off to the races, and I finally run out of cliches. With the backing of USA, Universal, and MCA, they gained access to a tremendous number of shows and films, like Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, Night Gallery, The Incredible Hulk, Kolchak the Night Stalker, and The Bionic Woman, along with a ton of shorter-lived genre shows that hadn't been seen since their original airings and that you probably don't remember, such as Misfits of Science, The Other World, Planet of the Apes the series, Gemini Man, and My Secret Identity. You know, the one where Jerry O'Connell uses spray paint cans to fly? In retrospect, that show may have been a metaphor for the dangers of abusing inhalants. Granted, this was hardly a murderer's row of programs, and the Disney-MGM deal had to be scrapped because of Universal's partial ownership.
They kept us on for 2 years as executive vice chairman. And basically it was to sell to the cable operators the story, because there's nobody like an entrepreneur that is starting a business that has the passion. And I had the passion, and I did sell a great many cable operators to the concept to free up a channel and to show the Sci-Fi Channel.
But it was now July 1992, and they'd come a hell of a long way from where they were just a few months ago. With the sale complete, the much-delayed launch was finally set for September of 1992. A gala event at New York's Hayden Planetarium was set to officially mark the launch of the Sci-Fi Channel. That cryptic countdown finally reached zero. A title card memorialized Isaac Asimov and Gene Roddenberry, who had both passed away just months before. And now it was time for the first official broadcast of the brand new Sci-Fi Channel. And what was the first program set to be aired? What else but Star Wars? Technically, it was the first episode of FTL Newsfeed, but then it was Star Wars.
my childhood onward, some of my very best experiences have been watching science fiction movies.
I was a big horror movie fan, science fiction fan from way back.
I think science fiction makes us think in different ways, and
everyone likes to sort of wonder what will it be like, 100 years from now.
Anything can happen in the next half hour.
Now, after almost 4 years of planning, meetings, press releases, and a Middle Eastern war, Mitchell Rubenstein and Laurie Silvers had seen the Sci-Fi Channel go from an idea to reality, just to lose control of it to a couple of giant corporations right at the very end. But don't feel too bad for Mitch and Laurie. Remember, they got into this to make money, and the estimated price tag for the sale of the Sci-Fi Channel? Well, depending who you ask, it was somewhere between $30 and $100 million. But honestly, it was probably closer to 30. Well, that ends it for the first part of my history of the Sci-Fi Channel. Next time we'll explore the channel in the 90s, a period some older fans, dorks, consider its prime, where it once again searches for credibility from science fiction fans, gives America a proper introduction to anime, saves a beloved cult classic, gives second lives to canceled shows, makes a jump to original programming, has more owners than you can count, before ultimately becoming part of a much larger corporate machine, and we see the beginning of the sci-fi's true network decay.